Hello, today we are going to examine the self. Specifically, we're going to examine the themes of narrative and group. Let's review what we've already talked about. Sociologists argue that the self is created through interaction. And we've talked about three themes. We've talked about the theme of props. We could also call it bling, status symbols, objects. We've talked about space, also known as location, place, environment. And we've talked a little bit about power and authority. I want you to notice that social scientists use different words to say the same thing. So if you are interested in becoming a social scientist, as you read an article, I want you to notice that one person might call it space, another person might call it a location, but they're talking about the same thing. So what we can do is grab that, put it into one theme, and say, you know what? Everyone's talking about space. They may call it different things, but they're all talking about space. I'm going to focus on this theme called space. So keep that in mind. Also, I want to tell everyone that as you read every single article, go back and visit the old themes. So as you read about Codependents Anonymous, ask yourself about power and space. As you're reading the article about the girl hunt, think about props, think about space, think about power. As you're reading about the media and adolescent girls, again, revisit these themes and ask yourself, how are these themes relevant to those articles? New material. Today we're going to talk about narrative. You'll hear people call this story or a script, anything of that sort. Just keep that in mind. If you hear someone use a phrase, ask yourself, are they talking about narrative or story? Same thing, we're going to talk about groups today. Goffman referred to groups as audience, but you can call them groups, you can call them audience, you can call them friends. The idea here is that when somebody presents themselves, they're usually doing it to a group, an audience, friends, a number of people. So, the thing I want to start off with today is that there is a debate. This is probably one of the first debates we've encountered. Actually, no, this is the second debate we've encountered. The first debate was about authenticity. Are we being authentic, our authentic self, when we are in front of power? Are we our authentic self when we are with our friends? That was about Scott and the idea of authenticity of self. Does the authentic self exist or does it not exist? Here's another debate we have. Goffman argues that every moment we are creating ourself. So a lot of people will read Goffman and say that the self is not permanent, it is elusive. We're always recreating ourselves in different environments. I might be a teacher in the classroom, but I can go to some place and be a biker and have spikes and leather and act like a totally different person. So in other words, some people take Goffman to say that the self doesn't really exist. It's not consistent. There's no core self. It's dramatically realized on every occasion. There are other sociologists in the other school that say that a consistent and core self does exist. So this is a big debate within sociology. We've got the debate about authenticity, and we've got the debate about whether the consistent and core self exists. So today we're going to talk about somebody named Irvine, and she's doing research on Codependents Anonymous. She argues that the self is more than the sum of its parts. If we add up the fact that I'm a teacher, and a father, and a husband, and a citizen, and I have political beliefs, when you add up all that, it's actually more than the sum of the parts. In other words, 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. 2 plus 2 equals 5. The narrative is what allows it to be more. How do I create my selfhood? It's by telling powerful stories about myself. When we portray these stories as real, when I tell people a story about my life, what I'm doing is I'm narrating my story. I'm creating myself. So, let's talk a little bit about narrative and storytelling. Who are we telling the story to? Well, Irvine, interestingly, is arguing that the core self exists, and she wants to pull us away from sociology. She wants to go towards psychology. She's arguing that we tell our stories to others, but we're also telling our stories to ourselves. In telling our stories, we reassure ourselves that we exist. If you've ever met somebody who lies, they believe their own lies. They tell their lies to themselves and they believe their own lies. So the idea here is that as we narrate our lives, we're narrating it to others, and we're narrating to ourselves. Irvine argues that narratives have some important aspects. She argues that institutions provide autobiographical occasions. Let me give you a simple way of understanding autobiographical occasions. First day of class, at most college courses, the teacher will say, please introduce yourself to the class, tell us your major, tell us what your favorite book is. And that's an autobiographical occasion. You get to narrate who you are to others. Maybe you go on a first date, and you're on the date and you're telling the other person who you are. You're narrating a story about your life. You're narrating an issue that you want to talk about, maybe something important that happened to you. First dates are autobiographical occasions. If you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the first things you have to do is identify yourself, and you have to engage in that narrative moment of storytelling. So lots of institutions provide this for us. Even our martial arts clubs, Boy Scouts of America, they will provide autobiographical occasions where you get to narrate your life. But remember, you're narrating it to others, and you're narrating it to yourself. So that's the first important aspect of narrative. The second important aspect is the idea that institutions shape the sequence and formula of that narrative. Of course, we're going to turn to her example in a moment of Codependents Anonymous, but the idea here is that your family is an institution, and it shapes the proper telling of the story. Maybe you try to tell a story in your family, and your mother interjects, and she says, oh, no, he's telling it wrong. First, what happened was this. Second, this happened. Or maybe you're at school, and the teacher says, introduce yourself to the class. Well, the teacher will say, please tell us your name first, your major second, what career you're interested in third. They're telling you how to sequence the story. They're telling you the formula. Sort of like baking a cake, you know that a cake has flour and butter and sugar. They're telling you what are the proper ingredients for your narrative. And different institutions will have different sequences and different formulas. So again, Irvine's example is Codependents Anonymous. I want you again to remember that this is an example. We actually don't care about Codependents Anonymous other than the fact that it helps us learn about narration and self. So again, frame it as an example. Irvine learned that the sequence of the narrative had a particular sequence at this location. People who were in Codependents Anonymous first had to narrate their abused childhood, which was the origin of their codependency. That abusive childhood excused their dysfunction. Eventually they hit rock bottom. They joined Codependents Anonymous, they worked the program, and they redeemed the past. When people in Codependents Anonymous tried to stray from this sequence, the other group members pushed them back. They'll say, whoa, wait a second. You have to talk about how you worked the program. You have to talk about how you made it work, and you followed the steps, and you pulled yourself through. You skipped that step. So this is an important part of institutions. And not just Codependents Anonymous does this. Many institutions do this. Individuals in Codependents Anonymous have this narrative formula and sequence, but they're crafting a personal story. So as you narrate the formula and the sequence, you do get to personalize it. Let me give you an example. Has somebody ever asked you how you met your husband or your wife, or how you met your boyfriend or girlfriend? Well, there's a formula to that story. You had to meet first. How did you meet? How did you start liking each other? How did the person propose? Things like that. There's certain formula elements that have to go into that narrative. Now, everyone has to tell those elements of the formula, but we can each personalize it in a different way. So do you see how the narrative is simultaneously personal and universal? Just like we can all make a cake with flour, sugar, butter, milk, those are the ingredients, we do get to personalize our cake. We put our name on it, we put a certain number of candles, maybe our family sings one song, your family sings another song. There are personalized elements of the account, but the account is simultaneously, has to subscribe to cultural standards. So let's jump from the idea that narrative and self go together to the idea that self and groups go together. So we're going to turn to a woman named Milky, She actually used to teach at the University of Maryland, where I went to graduate school. She was a really interesting person. She wrote articles about women and their hair and how that impacts their presentation of self. It was interesting because Milky used to come to work with her hair in just complete upside downness. And because she understood about how women interpret their hair. So Milky's research looks at white girls and black girls. She was looking at how the media's presentation of women in magazines impacts their self-image. She finds that white girls were more likely to read teen magazines, and she found that white girls and black girls were critical of the magazine's representations of beauty. When she got into a room with a teenage black girl, the black girl said, "Man, those magazine girls are not real." The white girl said the same thing. They looked at the supermodels and they said, "Those are unrealistic." Yet, white girls judged themselves with regard to the women in the magazine. Black girls did not. Black girls also show higher levels of self-esteem than white girls. Across the board, if you look at the research, black women are showing higher levels of self-esteem than white women. So the question, of course, becomes, why? Why do we see these differences between white girls and black girls? And it's particularly interesting to focus on when both white girls and black girls both say that the media offers unrealistic representation. So why would there be this difference when they're both critical of the media? Milky offers the third-person effect. The idea here is that we think we are very critical of the media, but we don't think our friends are. If you ask somebody about, I don't know, Fox News, they will say, "Oh man, Fox News is just unbelievable and it's sensationalism and it's overdramatic." And if you ask them about what other people think of Fox News, they will say, "Oh, those people, they swallow Fox News hook, line, and sinker." The idea here is that we think we can be critical of media, but we don't think the people around us can be critical of media. And she calls this the third-person effect. She says that the media impacts us indirectly through our friends. We might say, "Man, I don't need an iPhone, I don't need a fancy car," but we think that the people around us think we need an iPhone and a fancy car, and those people are judging us as being less than because those people follow the media. White girls believe that other white girls and boys evaluate their appearance in relation to the images in the magazines. They hear young men talking about Cindy Crawford, they hear the girls talking about how pretty that model is, and they believe that the other people around them are using those images as a metric to evaluate beauty. Black girls, on the other hand, did not believe that their friends, their other black girls, the men that they were hanging out with, they didn't believe that those people used those images to evaluate them. They said, "That is white culture, those are white models, I'm not being measured against those white models." And they had higher self-esteem because of it. So today we've talked about how narrative and audience or group impacts the self. Ask yourself about these articles, whether power played a relevance, whether props played a relevance, whether power, props, and space. Whether space was relevant. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Ask yourself. You should also read the article about the girl hunt and see what that article is all about and how it helps us understand the self.